Okay, we are live, and if you can hear us, you might just hit the chat and say you can hear us. Yeah, the people rolling in. All right.
Oh, Stephanie, it says chat disabled, Sarah.
Yeah, you know, it does that once in a while, and I can't quite, it starts out fine as soon as I hit the live button, it goes chat disabled, but I just sent a chat, so you can do it on the Q&A too. Looks like, yep, I can hear you, chat disabled. All right, good. Okay, we've got 20 of us attending so far, so in the effort to start on time and give our presenters maximum amount of presentation time, I'd just like to welcome you all. My name's Stephanie Aden. I'm the Executive Director for AIA. Welcome to the very first day of Architecture Month, and we have lots of events throughout the month that I'll talk about later on. But I am really excited about today's presentation by Coffman Engineers, Getting It Right This Time, Resiliency and Human Health. They presented, gosh, way back towards the beginning of the pandemic. And so I know they've gathered a lot of new information and are excited to share that today. So as always, if you guys could email me at office@aiaspokane.org if you're an architect and want to receive and you're a member, want to receive credit, go ahead and send me both your name and your member number, and I'll get those recorded. But I also want to take the opportunity to introduce Georgia Spencer. She represents CSI Spokane. They are one of our sponsors for Architecture Month, and in an effort to increase participation and have a fun factor, we are supporting the Spokane dining scene with $50 gift card giveaways at each and every webinar. At the end of the presentation, we will be announcing that random winner. And we're also asking that you, if you attend multiple presentations, I think we've got 12, the top 10 people that attend the most presentations will also get a $50 gift card. So that's sponsored by CSI and AIA Spokane. So we're just anxious to have everybody join us and learn lots of information this month, and it's going to be really fun. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our presenters real quick. We have Tracy Hannigan, who's back again after the last presentation. She's principal and professional engineer, mechanical engineer out of the Spokane office, and Martin Miller's out of the Anchorage office, and he's a project manager and also mechanical engineer. We do encourage Q&A throughout the presentation. You go ahead and use that Q&A button down below, and they will work their best to answer those questions as they come about and are relevant to what they're talking about. And finally, I'm just going to go ahead and, since you are getting credit for this presentation, just go over the learning objectives. There are 4 of them. They will discuss how public trust, health, and welfare are protected by resilient design. Discuss the strategies and technologies that design professionals need to consider to combat infectious disease outbreaks such as COVID-19 and other disasters. Recognize how our non-technical behaviors strongly influence how we build a resilient mindset or not. Review examples of resilient designs that protect public health and safety. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and unshare my screen and let these guys take it over.
Right.
All right.
Thanks, Stephanie. Appreciate it.
Yeah.
For that to pop up, it still says you're sharing.
Yeah, I'm trying to get that unshared.
Thanks everyone for joining us today. Perfect. Okay. There we go. I put my contact information up so that you could reach out to me if you have more questions or comments just about the presentation today. I encourage you to ask questions. Martin's going to watch the Q&A for me and let me know if something pops up right now. We'll also have some Q&A time at the end. So this presentation is about human health. It's also about resiliency. And I wanted to start off with just a couple minutes of just thinking about what emotions the term resiliency draws in you and what kinds of things we think about as being resilient. So just looking at some images, some of them may be familiar to you. This is one where my daughter said, yep, dandelions are resilient, maybe a little too resilient. Animals, plants, people. If you're screaming, you're not resilient. So this might be someone who had their head in the sand like an ostrich and ignored the problem and now finds that things aren't going very well for them. So we're going to spend some time today trying to not be ostriches with our head in the sand, because we know that people are resilient and it affects the health of everybody on this planet. We had to deal with that on the planet here this last year. This was at the ASHRAE Orlando conference last February. This was the first screenshot that I took on my phone of the Johns Hopkins data on the COVID pandemic. And we had 24,000 cases worldwide. We had 11 cases in the United States at that time. And over the months, I've taken screenshots again and again and watched those numbers just climb exponentially. And here's where we are today. No fooling, April Fools. My daughter got up in the night and stuck bubble wrap under the carpets in the hallway. So we had a good laugh this morning, but 129 million cases. And we know that's not really the true count, but the pandemic's just been life-changing for many people in the world. I've spent the last year plus on the ASHRAE Epidemic Task Force, looking at guidance and research to recommend how facilities should change what they're doing with their HVAC systems in order to reduce the risk of COVID-19. We had a statement on the transmission of SARS-CoV-2. I'll let you read that there. And we just recently updated that statement. This one here was issued in April of last year. And we just rephrased it a little bit, making it stronger as the research has become even more concrete about the airborne component of SARS-CoV-2. Last year, we were looking at surge. This is just a quick screenshot from a facility that was being retrofit to handle sick COVID patients. And I was working at that time with the Washington State Department of Health, helping them evaluate potential sites that we could use for surge, because Washington was definitely a hot spot early on in the pandemic. And so I thought I'd share some of this with you, because as you start thinking about designing buildings or retrofitting buildings, you can consider, well, what are some things that maybe make a facility more or less useful for either something like surge or being a place where the community could go and have sanctuary place. So these are some of the things we started looking at. And then we also added a few things of our own. This is just an early draft where we were looking at some more considerations on the HVAC side of things. And these slides will be made available to you later. So don't worry about trying to write all that down. You have a copy of that. After a while, ASHRAE got a request from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. They asked the Epidemic Task Force if we could help them collaborate to do a better job of planning out these alternate care sites. And so a group of us, I'm the healthcare lead on the Epidemic Task Force. And so we set up a subgroup of us to work with U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and put together this guidebook. And it's got some really helpful information. It's a free download that you can access. One of the main chairs from the U.S. Army Corps, Alexander Zehoff, he put together also a really great paper on resiliency, where he's got some scoring systems to rate the risk levels in terms of location and what's going on in a building, to decide what might I need to do in terms of power or HVAC to help make a building more resilient. So if you're interested in that paper, I'd be happy to share that with you. This is a info diagram that you can use to navigate the ASHRAE Epidemic Task Force page. and the webpage address is down at the bottom. We have a bunch of building guides you'll see down there in the lower right. We have special guidance for schools and universities, healthcare facilities, commercial buildings, laboratories. We just put out a fairly recent set of guidance for communities of faith, residential, that sort of thing. We also put together guidance for operating buildings during pandemic conditions. And then if it's post-epidemic, what would you do for a building? There's specific guidance on filtration. And we have up at the upper left, you'll see that little circle that with the star, that's core recommendations that we put out recently to help people understand the main core guidance that we're putting out that's universal across all of the building guides in terms of dealing with SARS-CoV-2. We also put together some one-page guidance documents, and you can access these right off the main ASHRAE COVID webpage. The newest one we put out is laboratory. So there's more detailed guidance if you want it, but the one-page summaries are pretty nice. And especially the in-room air cleaner one, I think is really helpful if you're looking to put something like that in your home or office or in a school classroom. This is a sign up at our house. And my daughter said to me the other day, she just happened to look up at it. She said, "Mom, why do you have to wait until everything fails? Why not just hug the dog first?" And I said, I'm going to use that in one of my presentations, because sometimes when we think about epidemic preparedness or resiliency, sometimes people do put their head in the sand and they wait until things fail before they act or do something that's going to help them. And we really want to do things in advance because it's less expensive to do so, and because we can have a bigger impact on people's health if we have buildings that are resilient at the same time. The public is counting on us to take care of them. They assume when they walk into a building that things are correct in terms of ventilation, that the CDC has got plenty of N95 masks stocked up. And so unfortunately, public trust gets undermined often. And I wanted to share 3 publications that I think highlight that are just recommended reading for you. This is a story, the Warnings Unheeded book by Andy Brown, about tragedies locally here at Fairchild Air Force Base. There was the situation where there was a mass shooting out at the Air Force Base, and then 4 days later, there was a B-52 crash. And in both cases, there were lots of signs and warnings about what might be happening or about to happen that were ignored. And Andy Brown gathered a lot of that information, and he presents some really great thoughts that could be applied toward different areas of our lives when we start thinking about resiliency and preparedness and paying attention to the important things that need to happen. And this book, 5 Days at Memorial, is about Hurricane Katrina and some of the lessons learned and what went on at Memorial Hospital. And I have some quotes later that I'll share with you from the book, but I think it's excellent reading if you're trying to get into that mindset of resiliency and what kinds of things make a difference in a real disaster and how many different things could go wrong at the same time. This is a great book to illustrate that. And lastly, Lori Garrett's book, Betrayal of Trust. She wrote The Coming Plague before she published this book, and they're both just excellent stories. The Betrayal of Trust really talks about global public health and how the public is expecting things to be taken care of and how that really doesn't happen often. But we're in a position with our careers as architects and engineers. We also have potentially, I think there's some high school students that have joined us today that are considering architecture as a career. So let's give a shout out to you guys. Thanks for tuning in. And hopefully you'll learn some good stuff in here about how architects can really make a difference in terms of health and getting us closer toward earning that trust of the public. This is just one quick example of a planned facility for emergency operations. A whole group of architects and engineers put together this report. This was government funded, a huge 8-story resilient facility that was supposed to be a prototype for other places across the country. And unfortunately, funding got discontinued. And the final product is this. It's this tent and then a separate little storage space. Pretty dismal. This is a chart that shows what happened with funding from 2010 through 2017. Unfortunately, not a lot of it went to the hospitals that needed money to upgrade their HVAC systems or prepare in other ways for global pandemics, other health emergencies. A lot of it went towards stockpiling things. And as we learned during the recent year, not all the right things were stockpiled in the right amounts. So we have to be thinking about what could possibly happen. I know that the federal government hired some people that wrote screenplays for movies to try and think of scenarios of things that could go wrong, and then use that to inform the Department of Homeland Security on what kinds of threats we might face and how to prevent those. So we have to use that imagination of ours of what could go wrong to then say, okay, now we can come up with ways to prevent that. I want to give an example here of a building. This was the E.H. Koch Center for Cancer Care, and it's in New York City at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. The facility director here, Steve Friedman, is a friend of mine, and I got to tour this building when it was under construction. After the hurricane that went through with Sandy, and they had a ton of flooding in New York City, they didn't want to have problems with this building, and so they put together some really innovative things for the facility to keep it protected. You can see in the picture that it's right on the Hudson River, and the risk of flooding is really high. Steve does a great presentation. He show you neat photos and how they design these amazing structural flood barriers at the property line. And they did things like weld some of the storm and sanitary piping below the second floor, and some of the domestic water piping as well, so that it could function even if water got in at the lower levels. His point in sharing this was to talk about some of the resilient features of the building, but also to show how when it was integrated into the project from the start, that it was only about 2% of the total construction cost. This was a 750,000 square foot, 28-story building. So has all kinds of different facilities in it, but they integrated it from the beginning, and the cost impact was very small. They have already started to see some benefits from some of the features that they put into this building just in dealing with the pandemic over the last year. And these are a couple of books to share that you might find helpful. The HVAC Design Manual for Hospitals and Clinics is a second edition book. I helped author part of it. And I wanted to point out that chapter 10 in this publication covers disaster planning and emergency management. And I went back and re-looked at that section some time ago, and again just yesterday. And there's great information to just get your mind thinking about what would I do with the facility to make it more resilient. And there were about a dozen people that helped put together that section, but one of the guys that led that particular chapter was a facility director himself who had been through all kinds of different events. So that's a great publication, great information in that. And then the Healthy Buildings book, I've got it right here. This is one that Joe Allen, John McCumber wrote that talk a lot about the impact that we as designers can have on people's health. In fact, they argue in the book that the maintenance person that operates and runs your building that you work in probably has a greater impact on your health than your own doctor. So if we want to earn and maintain that trust, it makes me think about this Shel Silverstein poem that was a favorite of mine as a kid. Hopefully some of you recognize it also. But a few pieces of advice from me on earning and maintaining the trust of the public is to not listen to the buses and to think about what needs to happen. And you may be the only person in the room, but you may be the most important voice in the room, speaking up about a feature in a building that really needs to be designed in. And thinking about decisions on a project through a lens of trust and not only a lens of cost. And this gets to be a challenge because we know very well that projects never seem to have enough budget. We don't have enough construction budget to build the program that we want to build. So how do we make decisions about what stays in the project and what goes? You know, famous value engineering. We need to bring in that element of what are people trusting and expecting of us from this building, and use that to help inform some of our decisions instead of just that heavy cost decision-making lens. And then remembering that reality can be very different than just what a regulatory box says to check. The codes that we have out there are bare minimum standards. They're not best practices, they're bare minimum. And so oftentimes we need to be going beyond code minimum in the designs that we produce. And I put this one up here as share personal stories because I find when I'm talking with people about decisions on a project that if I just make a recommendation for something, like I think you should put the generator up on a higher level, sometimes people just can't relate to why that's so important, or they'll easily dismiss it. But if you can share a personal story from a project, well, we had a generator on this project. We talked about raising it up, but it was going to be an extra $40,000 to do that. Later, they had a flood and the generator didn't work, and they lost $2 million in revenue at the facility because of that situation. People tend to listen to that more. So I encourage you to listen to other people's stories or to build your own examples and have those at the ready when you're looking to talk with owners, or if you're an engineer, when you're talking with your architect clients about different elements of the design and why they might be important. Architects, though, really do take the charge. You're prime on the project, and you have that responsibility and that privilege to lead the discussion about resiliency and how things would go in a building. Back in 2018, AIA updated their code of ethics, and they included special language about recommending and pointing out to your owners when certain decisions were being made that would take them away from resilient buildings that could handle climate change, from things that weren't sustainable or that might have other unintended consequences. There were a number of different provisions changed in that. And I think that's an additional service offering. You know, it's not common practice for architects to spend a lot of programming time delving into disaster and emergency planning on a lot of buildings, maybe more so on some particular facilities, but now across the board, people are looking for that and wanting to know what can my building do if there's a disaster. And those building designs really affect the health of the people that live in them. This is a paper that I recommend you download for free off the internet and read. They did a great study on a whole bunch of buildings, particularly LEED buildings, where they weren't taking advantage of the credit to provide additional outside air, more ventilation. Most often because they said, well, if we go for the ventilation credit, it's going to hurt us on the energy side. And the conclusion of this paper is that the public health benefits from the added ventilation were way better than the economic penalty that was associated with increasing the ventilation in the space. We have a lot of contaminants generated indoors, both by the people that are in there and by our furnishings. And so having additional ventilation really improves people's productivity and their overall human health. This is a particular study I wanted to share, just where outlining the importance of good indoor air hydration. We know that we don't want to have super humid buildings where we have condensation inside and get a mold problem, because that's obviously very bad for people's health. But people didn't realize for a long time the damaging effects of dry air. And so this was one of many studies that I could share with you about where they took preschools and they humidified some of the classrooms and left some of the other classrooms unhumidified, and the air in there was really dry. And they found a higher percentage of airborne virus particles in the dry rooms. Those virus particles were more virulent or more infectious. And then they found, as the best marker of how the building's performing, they found more students that were out sick in the dry building than in the well-humidified building. So I want to talk just a minute about a concept, I call it doubling down. And doubling down, well, let me start with a story first. My grandfather, when he was older, was living alone still. And one day he fell down his stairs while he was going to the basement to do some laundry. And my aunt and uncle and my mom were later sitting around talking about what to do. Should they move him into a nursing home? Should they try to get him a laundry service? Should they try to relocate his washer and dryer upstairs and replumb and duct that all in? And my grandfather walked in and he said, don't worry about it. I've taken care of the problem. I said, what? And he said, well, I put a mattress at the bottom of the stairs. And, I call it doubling down. I mean, he came up with something, he had a mattress and then he used it for another purpose. And that's maybe more of a funny example, but I think about how I like to camp and I hunt and I fish. And when we have things go on like windstorms and ice storms we've had in Spokane in the past few years, and the power goes out, I'm really thankful that I have a whole bunch of camping gear in the basement. I have sleeping bags, I have extra water bottles and headlamps and cook stoves. So I think about these things where they have multiple purposes and they don't just sit somewhere and go unused until there's a crisis. We can use them all the time. So I like to encourage you, as you're designing buildings and you're designing systems, to think about, where could I double down? How could we put a layout of a building or a feature into it that could have a second purpose that would be helpful in a time of need? And I came up with 3 quick examples of things. One is an in-room air cleaner. I have one in my house, and it's been great during the pandemic for taking viruses out of the air and lowering that concentration of contaminants. It was also really nice this fall when we had that horrible week of wildfire smoke. It's also really nice in allergy season. There was a paper just released this last month talking about pollen, and people who get exposed to a lot of pollen, have allergies, have a diminished immune response during that time, which makes them more susceptible to infection. So having an in-room air cleaner is great because you can use it for a lot of different things. Keeping a building at 40% to 60% relative humidity, which is really that sweet spot of RH, gives you improved comfort. We know it affects people's productivity. We have studies that show that it improves your sleep quality at night, and it also improves your immune function and your resistance to infection. It reduces stress. Some Japanese researchers determined that your skin produces a whole bunch of cortisol, which is a stress hormone, and that happens when it's really dry in the air. But when you have good humidified air, your skin doesn't produce as much cortisol, so that keeps your stress level down. We also know that dry air increases virus infectivity for not all viruses, but for a great many of them. And it also increases airborne transmission. So if you have a well-humidified place, you don't have particulates from like coughs and sneezes that dry out and float in the air for long distances. They tend to settle out quickly and be cleaned. So a humidifier does a ton of great things for us if we can keep our buildings in the 40 to 60% relative humidity range. Also, or smoke control. Some of the operating rooms, well, they used to all have smoke control in them. Now it's an option. So the code has said it doesn't have to be in there, but you can have it if you want. One thing we learned during the pandemic, I had hospitals talking to me about using some of their ORs, and selected cases were canceled, to use some of those to house COVID positive patients, like an inpatient room or a makeshift ICU. And the facilities that had smoke control designed in their ORs could more easily adapt those ORs with exhaust out of those spaces instead of return air, so that they could better cohort and protect those spaces from people who weren't sick with COVID. This is a bad idea of cohorting. Just throw it in here for fun. You like to watch Candid Camera. My kids had no idea what Candid Camera was. So I showed them a few of these a while ago, and they had a combination people in Pet MD, where this guy went in for his doctor's appointment and they'd set it up to be a vet clinic at the same time. So if you need a good laugh, try some Candid Camera. There's a couple other publications to share when we're thinking about resiliency. ASHRAE has produced some net zero advanced energy design guides. These are laid out so well. They are so easy to use when you're looking for ideas, especially early on in a project where you're in that programming schematic design type phase. You're thinking about what a building could have to get to net zero. They've got climate specific suggestions and examples. They're just laid out really well. The website at the bottom right-hand corner is where you can access those all for free download. These were produced by ASHRAE, but they were also collaborative effort, including AIA, U.S. Green Building Council, Department of Energy funded a lot of that work. And a couple other publications that are on that same website There's a newer version, that publication that just came out, that's the Damp Buildings, Human Health and HVAC Design, that has some good information to reduce the likelihood of having a mold problem in a building. And then the document on the right, an indoor air quality guide, again, laid out very well, worked on in collaboration with AIA. It's got some great information in it, you might find useful. So sometimes the designs we do and whether or not we're going to have buildings that are healthy for people or resilient are just a matter of priorities. And sometimes we have unintended consequences when we make choices. So I'm going to give you a checklist, because I promised that when we talk about learning objectives and things that you would see with this presentation. These are some ideas more on the technical side of features we could put in buildings that would help them to be more resilient. Some of these are lessons learned over the last year. Some of these are things that I've found over the course of my entire career. So we have to figure out cheaper ways to prepare, because some of the interventions that people come up with are really expensive and they're just not cost effective. The ventilated headboard is a great invention for hospitals. Thinking about utility connections and locations. You read the Hurricane Katrina book that I recommended, the 5 Days of Memorial. They've got some good examples of things that could all go wrong at the same time, get you thinking in that mode. When I was, I'd say, kind of in that April-May timeframe last year, helping a lot of hospitals figure out what to do during the pandemic with their facilities, and they were dealing with the surge, a lot of them complained about the fact that it was hard to separate certain building areas from others. Some buildings really lended themselves toward that and an easy isolation, and other buildings didn't. And they really wanted to get that feedback back to the architects to say, when you're designing the configuration of a hospital or any other building for that matter, where they might use that to isolate cohort patients who are infected, think about how easily you could visqueen off an area or put an airlock in. And you can think of some situations where that would go better or worse at a certain building. Also been helping design some modifications, especially to nursing home type facilities, where they have areas coming into a building where you could screen people. I think the airline industry went through this after 9/11. Like, gosh, they weren't laid out for all the TSA screening. Now we're thinking about that same stuff for a lot of our buildings, and where would that happen? How would we pressurize parts of buildings? And then thinking about, from an interior design standpoint, what kinds of surfaces and materials are easy to clean or durable against harsh cleansers or are resistant to the UVG light, because we have some recommendations in some locations to have upper room UVGI, but if you have materials that aren't compatible, you can end up damaging part of the building. And then site considerations. I'm sure that civil engineers in our office could give you a whole hour presentation on some really important site considerations that don't always come to mind right away when you think about resiliency and epidemic preparedness. And then this one specifically for healthcare is coming up with good spaces for donning and doffing of equipment, where that's going to be stored. And if you're treating patients that are infected in a certain area, do you have a way to do some lab testing or diagnostic tests in that same vicinity? You know, you don't really want to put a sample of a highly infectious disease into the pneumatic tube system at a hospital and shoot it over to the lab that's on the other side of the building. So coming up with those kinds of plans up front is important. The building systems really need to have inherent flexibility. And this is another lesson that I saw come up many times in the last year, where people were trying to modify their HVAC systems to have things like upgraded filtration to MERV 13 or better, but their systems couldn't handle it. They couldn't transition to 100% exhaust. They wanted to add more ventilation, and they could do it for part of the year, but they couldn't do it during the summer, and they couldn't do it during the winter because the temperature extremes were too much. They also didn't have the ability to change some of their room air distribution, but some facilities had systems with a little bit of cushion in them, or they were the system type that could be modified and adjusted to make some of these recommendations happen. So some people were really glad for this, and some people were really frustrated that they didn't have any options in the building system that they had. Last one was that 40% to 60% relative humidity. And from an architectural standpoint, architects have a really big part to play in making this possible because the building envelope needs to be robust enough to have a building humidified to 40% relative humidity inside and not have a condensation problem like the Dr. Pepper can that's in the photo. We learned a lot about medical gas. I could talk about it for a long time, but I just give that as just a quick highlight of things that there's considerations when you're designing that sort of a system. When people started putting infectious patients in parts of buildings that weren't designed for that, or just thinking about there could be infected people in an office building or something, you have relief air. That relief air could potentially become contaminated air if there's somebody infectious in the space that's being served by that system. And we don't always locate relief air discharge points outside, really far away from outside air intakes or for where people might be walking along a sidewalk or something. So when you're thinking about how a building lays out and where you have shafts and louvers, the mechanical engineer and the architect really need to collaborate and find good places for relief air so that it's treated more like contaminated exhaust as opposed to just air that's okay to be close to an outside air intake. This is another example of what's code minimum versus what's a best practice and what does the public expect and trust that we're doing. And then lastly, hot water generation and piping capacity became a big deal during the pandemic. More people washing their hands for longer periods of time, some people wanting to hook up hand washing facilities outside their building and not having capacity to be able to pipe up to that from the building. Quick example on the lower right, there's a photograph of a heating hot water system. This is up at Sacred Heart Medical Center. We did a big chiller plant upgrade project a couple of years ago. And we, in the course of the project, decided to also take out the domestic hot water heaters because the tanks were a source of potential Legionella contamination, and the hospital had had an outbreak a few years ago. When we went to do that, we had to take down the water heaters that serve the whole main tower of Sacred Heart. So we decided to backfeed them from the emergency department system. And we learned at that time that the emergency department system only has one domestic hot water heater. And I'm not really sure why it didn't have a redundant one there. But instead of just tying into that to feed the tower while we changed over to the new heaters, we piped everything up with piping that could remain forever and valved it so that in the future, the new tower water heaters could back up the emergency department. And I think everyone just assumed that if a water heater went out in the emergency department, that there would be backup, but there wasn't until now. And so that kind of thinking as you're designing a project is something that could be incorporated for very minimal cost. Just plan that out ahead of time. Wanted to just give a shout out to Harlan Bretz. Harlan was the guy who came up with the whole idea of the Missoula flood that created all the channeled scab lands in eastern Washington, central Washington. And his ideas were really poo-pooed for almost all of his life. He was very old when he was finally recognized as having been right. And I think it's important to just understand his persistence and his dedication toward bringing an idea forward that maybe some others scoffed at. And maybe if you're in that position where you're trying to convince somebody that something's really important or true and you're not getting anywhere, just think of Harlan Bretz and maybe that'll give you some inspiration to stick with it and be more persistent. I have two more slides so I'm going to show you of some checklist items, and then Martin's going to give you some neat examples. Buildings are for people, not for energy saving. I think it's important to save energy. I've been involved in some studies right now for NYSERDA. That's the New York State Energy Research and Development Group. And they had us look at some reports that were done of buildings that implemented ASHRAE's epidemic preparedness guidance, and then looked at how much energy that was using, depending on what features they incorporated into the buildings. So we've been reviewing those reports, and we're going to be able to report on those results here shortly. So I'm excited to share that with you. We really need to pay a lot of extra attention to facilities like nursing homes where we had such a huge number of deaths, or our most vulnerable population. And I set up a special task group within our healthcare team on the task force just to look at residential healthcare facilities, and we put up some guidance on that. We had a couple of AIA members that were involved in that. Jane Rode was one of the ones who did a lot of the work for that, so appreciated her input to that guidance. I think about the fact that this could be me in a wheelchair in a nursing home, in 40 years or something like that. So I would like the facility to be really well designed. We want to think about what could be different if it's something besides a COVID pandemic that comes up, and how a building would need to respond. And then just encouraging us to think about buildings. We know from an energy efficiency standpoint that we want high mass buildings that have passive heating and cooling options. But when we think about resiliency, this is a double down kind of thing. High mass buildings tend to retain their indoor temperature longer after you have a failure of a system. So if you lose power, you lose your heating, the building's not going to get cold as fast. Or in the summertime, it's not going to heat up as fast. If the power goes out, you lose that if you've got high mass buildings in that facility. Statistic I was just going to share is that last year there were about 240 million cyber attacks just on healthcare facilities. That's 240 million cyber attacks on hospitals in 2020. So those facilities are just getting pounded with hackers trying to get in and access their data. And that's just hospitals, but many other places are seeing the same thing. So we have to think about all those kind of features when we're designing buildings for resiliency. And I need space to store materials. Thinking about what if people show up at a building and they want help. Sometimes people come to a hospital and they don't need healthcare, they just want food or water. Some people might want to sleep in a school if there's a fire in the area or something like that. You can never have enough isolation valves. It's helpful to have stubs outside of a building where you could tie up to backup services like bringing in a generator, bringing in a chiller, bringing in a medical oxygen supply, that kind of stuff, making sure that those are designed and accessible. And just a couple of reminders again about that public trust lens versus cost, and that constant struggle between having a building with resilient features versus trying to get more program area, because that drives a lot of the pressure I think that architects feel in design of we need this many rooms for office space in the building, or we need this much square footage for conference space, and fitting all that in is no small challenge. And so it's just like, man, this is another thing added on of now I've got to think of how to make buildings more resilient as well. So let's search for good ways to integrate that and double down and have spaces that can serve multiple purposes. Quick example is just kidney dialysis infrastructure. I've been on some projects where we've added or remodeled ICUs, and they usually ask for kidney dialysis infrastructure, and it almost always gets value engineered out. And I thought about that with a sense of dread during the pandemic, as we knew that a lot of COVID patients were having kidney failure and needed dialysis, and they were finding a lot of facilities were short on the infrastructure in their ICUs to be able to support that. So at this time, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to turn it over to Martin. He's going to give you some great examples, talk about resiliency and some of the projects that we've done. Martin?
Yeah, thanks, Tracy.
Yeah.
You seeing my presentation though?
Yes.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks a lot. Appreciate the time, and definitely very timely information. I appreciate listening into that. So my background is mechanical engineering as well. I've done HVAC design and kind of bridge into power generation and other utility work. So I kind of come at the resiliency issue from through that lens. I'd like to set up by putting resiliency in context, and I think Tracy already mentioned this. As compared to codes and standards that are required by law, resiliency goes a step beyond, and the idea is to maintain functionality with minimal disruption. So there's lots of different types of events that may occur over a building's lifetime, and I think it can be kind of overwhelming to, to try to imagine all of them and try to figure out how to plan for those. And of course, that's disregarding even the cost of planning for those. So there are many different types of events that we can plan for, and I think each industry and each location has its own kind of risk profile that that needs to be considered on an individual basis. There's two kind of categories that I think about planning for. On the one side, on the left, there's the boom. There's earthquake or flood or some sudden disaster that happens infrequently but has a very significant impact on ability to utilize the facility. And the stress version on the right is just maybe a long-term situation. Maybe it's climate change or sea level rise or any other number of things that can change over the life of a building that result in stresses on the building systems. To kind of put that into more sharper relief, I guess, we see a few examples here. So on the upper left is a house that was designed to withstand a flood in Galveston, Texas, that went through Hurricane Ike. It's kudos to the design team and the homeowner for paying for that. What's unclear from the picture is whether or not there's utility infrastructure in place that allows that house to still be occupied. So the structure is sound, it appears. Does it have electricity? Does it have safe drinking water? Does it have a sanitary system that's still functional? Those are issues that play into resilience of a facility that are normally considered external to the project, and maybe not rightfully so in all cases. Below that, you see a picture of a fuel truck delivering fuel, obviously through a very narrow road. Are our transportation systems set up to allow deliveries of critical goods after an emergency, whether it's a snowstorm or an earthquake, bridge failure, that kind of thing? In the center of the top of the page, you see a map of Central California, and the red areas are areas that have rolling blackouts due to the risk of wildfires. And so what happens is the local utility, Pacific Gas and Electric, shuts off power to millions of customers at times because they have a liability if their power lines spark a wildfire. They're not willing to take that risk. So this leaves customers that normally rely on electric power, obviously, in the dark, and in certain cases that's untenable. And of course, on the right, you're seeing ice in Texas and 90-degree heat in Alaska. It may not sound like a lot, but that record a couple of years ago is 17 degrees above our design temperature in Anchorage. So if you compare that to Spokane, you'd be looking at 110-degree temperature, summer temperature, which really puts a lot of stress on the whole system, whether it's the gas distribution system, the electric system. It really narrows the margin for error, which results in any type of, whether it's an equipment failure or otherwise, can result in impact to facilities that under normal conditions would not be observed. And these are just a couple other examples. Recent headlines: American Petroleum Institute backs carbon pricing. That could turn economics for building efficiency and utilities on its head here if that gets implemented. NASA's estimating 1 to 8 feet of sea level rise. And we just learned this week in Alaska that our power companies are lobbying to be exempted from liability associated with wildfires, so they don't have to implement rolling blackouts similar to the way California is doing it. So I think what we're seeing in places around the country are isolated incidents, but they point to kind of a broader need to take some of the risks that are normally considered external to a project and really consider those as you're in your planning and design phases. Getting into a couple examples here, we're looking at the Central Spokane YMCA, which was recently awarded one of the first U.S. Resiliency Council certifications at the silver level. So this certification, excuse me, at this time it's focused primarily on architectural and structural features, exiting, damage of the main systems, and recovery time. I think it's a good framework for owners, architects, and others to think about resiliency, and that can be expanded into other disciplines that are not currently covered in the evaluation. A little further afield, looking at a picture now of Galena, Alaska, which is a community right on the Yukon River on the north bank. The ice-filled land on the left is actually the Yukon that is flooded due to an ice dam. This event happened in 2013, and we've been working with the city of Galena for the past 5 or 6 years to restore and build back their infrastructure in a way that will help mitigate the risk of such severe damage that happened during this flood. The flood wiped out large sections of the town. Much of their housing stock was displaced, dislodged from its foundation, or destroyed. The city has really taken it upon themselves, and I give them lots of credit for doing so, of thinking of ways that even in this totally isolated small community with very little access to capital, they're finding ways that they can build back in a way that is mitigates future flood risks. And a couple of ways they've been doing that is building out a microgrid infrastructure in a way that has multiple distributed generation assets in different locations. So if one gets inundated, another one would be able to supply power to the town. They're also planning for future solar and battery installation. They also installed a district heating system based on a biomass boiler. It's a chip-fed system that serves about 15 large facilities. So if they lose their diesel fuel supply, they have a backup source of heat that could at least keep people warm when it's minus 50 degrees for a period of time. So pretty neat to work with that client and see those plans develop over. There's quite a planning process to make that happen. Another example is this Bethel hospital. They were adding about 300,000 square feet of hospital space, and it was determined early on that they intended to put in a combined heat and power plant so they could separate from the utility. They thought the rates were too high, and they thought that it would be more beneficial for them to self-generate and provide all their own heat and power. So working through a study on that, this project did not end up moving forward, and the reason I think is telling is that the operational costs of owning your own power plant, once you start factoring in all the redundancies and personnel and logistics, really didn't pencil out the way that they initially planned. And they also just wanted to stay focused on the core competency of their organization. So at the end of the day, it turned out that outsourcing that heat and power service from the local utility was more advantageous. In the Spokane region, there are any number of risks that can be considered. There's an article in the New Yorker a few years ago that discussed the really big one, the potential impacts of a very large earthquake in the Northwest. What impacts would this have on your facility, whether it's inability to, whether it's disruption of the transportation network or other services that come out of the Seattle region? In certain facilities, it may be warranted to pay attention to that kind of thing. Sorry. The next is the Babb Road fire. I know that there's a fire nearby last year, I believe, and there's an article I pulled from January that said Malden still awaits federal aid 4 months after fire. So I guess my question here is, can your facility wait for FEMA money or for help from the state or federal government, or do you need to be back up and operational sooner? And are there ways to accomplish that? I'm sure there's ways to accomplish it. It's just a matter of analyzing the risk and deciding how much money it's worth. This is my last slide. I just had a few takeaways as far as, I think most of them kind of speak for themselves, but industry guidance is, I wouldn't say that there's a clear path of guidance for designing around resiliency. I think there's a lot of different guidance from different organizations, but nothing consolidated at this point. So I expect that to develop over the next decade quite a bit. I think it's really important to define your goals ahead of time before the design process. And as Stacy alluded to, this is I believe an ad service to the owners. We really need to know what's critical for the functionality of the building ahead of time, so that we can incorporate any features necessary on early in the design process. Talked a lot about the external risks of transportation, utilities, and environmental change. O&M is key to preparedness. I think this is something that the Bethel Hospital kind of realized, that they didn't necessarily have the expertise to maintain their own power plant, and they started to get nervous about doing that, which is sound thing to consider. And then the very last thing I just wanted to point out is on resilient communities, there may be opportunities to identify needs within the community and funding opportunities to get some resilient features. Maybe there's other funding sources to pay for those things, whether it's grants or bonds. I think there's a community benefit that can be considered, and it's worth exploring that ahead of time. So with that, I'll transfer back to Stacy or Stephanie.
You're going to go back to me. Thanks. Okay, so I was just going to wrap things up. Share my screen. I got a nice newsletter the other day from one of our local organizations, the Vanessa Behan Crisis Nursery, and Amy Napton Vega was writing her little executive director note, talking about how it's easier to build strong children than to repair broken men. And I think it's she's talking about building resiliency in our children and our community. And I just really loved some of her words. She pointed out the $1 spent on a child is worth $17 later in medical, judicial, educational, and employment expenses for an adult. And when we think about money that we invest in our buildings, we're going to get similar kinds of paybacks in terms of our health for people and earning that trust from the public. There's a couple more things that I wanted to share, and we're running a little short of time, so I'll be brief. But I had some non-technical ideas for resiliency to bring up, and these are things that I just learned over the years that I picked up on, where facilities or people trying to be resilient did some things like move. Just real quickly, out of the Hurricane Katrina book, they were talking about how life and death in the critical first hours of a calamity typically hinged on the preparedness, resources, and abilities of those in the affected community with the power to help themselves and others in their vicinity. Those who did better did not wait idly for help to arrive. So they moved, they got stuff done, they took action. And we want to be doing that as we work on projects. And the cross-discipline solutions, I wanted to highlight that one. What I mean by that is that some people have careers in something like building design, and then they have a career in medicine. And all of a sudden they start merging the two and they think about how a building can affect people's health. And we sometimes poo-poo the way that young students or young people change jobs all the time or change careers. But I think this is really an opportunity that we should capitalize on, where when you hire somebody that's been in a little bit different industry for a while, they bring a new perspective to something. And that's how you get some really great solutions to problems that people who have been in the same career for a long time maybe don't see. And the last one that I just wanted to highlight is the inspire, don't bully. I think if you want to get the most out of your consultant, I know I've had times where people have said this is a tough job and we're going to hire you because we think you can do it, and it's so inspiring and you work really hard. And sometimes it's a tough job with a tough schedule, and if things go wrong, we'll see you in court or just kind of more of a tougher attitude. And it really, I've watched that take teams and just lower them down a notch in terms of their performance. And so I think architects really have that opportunity and that privilege to really inspire the people that they're working with to say, hey, let's see what we could do that's really different and new and not the same old, same old. So please keep those things in mind. Thank you for doing that. This is my 2014 Halloween picture, my whole pandemic office all ready to go. And Martin and I would be happy to answer any questions that you have.
Any questions for Tracy and Martin? Go ahead and put them in the Q&A panel. In the meantime, just want to say thank you. That's just great, and way to kick off to our theme, resilience in architecture. And it's just kind of great to hear how all these different disciplines under the AEC world are working towards that common goal and that vision of resilience. So, okay, well, if we'll go ahead and keep looking for the questions, but in the meantime, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen because I do want to share what else might be happening in Architecture Month. Let me go back because as I mentioned, we've got 12 different presentations, but I kind of want to take you through the middle of the month and then also disclose who our random winner is for the gift card. Next Thursday, we have building sustainability. We've got Woodworks, or the Woodworks Products Council, that's presenting wood's role in healthy forests and healthy buildings. Then on April 13th, we have Resiliency in Architecture Practice. This is a casual chat that we're going to do with our board members. We're looking for more architects to participate with the WSU architecture students. And it's just an opportunity to come, and they're very interested in what architects have done throughout this year to stay resilient, to keep their practices going, things of that nature. So please, this is more of a closed session, but there's a link from the website to go ahead and get signed up, and there'll be separate chat rooms. So it's going to be kind of a fun way to really interact with the students. And I know that students are really excited about this. On April 14th, we have Daniel McPhee, who's with the New York City Urban Design Forum, and he will have a conversation on design power and the pandemic. And then on April 15th, AIA will be sponsoring the One AEC event. And I'm really excited about this one. We're going to have a kind of a workshop on supercharging your award submissions. And this is really for construction, field of construction, and engineers and architects. John Kane, who was one of our jurors from the 2020 Design Awards, will be one of the panelists, as well as Benjamin Minnick, who's with the Seattle DJC, who's done a ton of, they've both done a lot of juries and a lot of different award competitions. And so they both have some great tips of how to put your best foot forward when you're submitting for these design awards. So you have the opportunity to get that award in the way that it's presented. So stay tuned for that. All the rest of them will become available as well, and you can find it on our website. And finally, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Georgia, who is our representative from CSI, to award our raffle.
Well, the grand prize winner this time for the $50 raffle ticket to locally owned Barachos, River City, Fast Eddie, Boombox, or Red Wheel is Emily Luke with MMEC. Congratulations, Emily. I will send you an email to find out how you want me to get that raffle ticket to you. Thank you.
So thank you, CSI, for the sponsorship. And we will be doing this at each and every one, as well as make sure you attend lots and you have opportunity to win at the end of the month for those of you that attend the most of our Architecture Month webinars. So let's see, any questions come up?
Oh, if you think,
No.
feel free to email.
Yeah, they're available. You know how to find them. This session is being recorded and will be posted on the AIA YouTube channel. And I know Tracy mentioned that the slides are available too, so you know how to reach her for those. And again, thank you for we had, 35 people participate in our first Architecture Month webinar. So really appreciate that support and have a great rest of your day and the great rest of your week. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.